Happy Friday. Yay, TGIF and all of that. Um, so, keeping with the theme of a front-end week and layouts and all that kind of fun stuff, today I'm going to be talking about responsive design, and then we're also going to get introduced to SAS today, and I don't mean my normal sense of humor when I say that. Also, good morning, Calgary. So this blog post I have up here was posted on the site A List Apart, which if you haven't already subscribed to, please do so, on May 25th, 2010. So over 8 years ago. Written by a guy named Ethan Marcotte, who at the time was respected but not famous. Now, because of this post, he's famous. And this is the post that introduced the idea of responsive web design to the world. And I will send you the link to it. It is a great read. It's quite long. But there's some amazing stuff in here. And really what's going on in this post is Ethan is waving his arms and saying, hey, wait a second. We've been building things the same way for 15 years. And the way that we've been building them is based on ideas that we took straight out of print publishing, where there was a very hard and fast boundary called the edge of the page that determined how much space we had and what we were able to put in there. And that doesn't apply to the web. And a couple reasons it doesn't apply to the web, and definitely keep in mind this was done in 2010, but he talks about the fact that what we see on a desktop is not the same as what we see on this little tiny screen. And that's a crime, in his opinion, because designers, content producers, web developers are all putting in dozens, hundreds hours of work to create these digital properties. And now they're actually having to double and in some cases triple their work in order to have it be able to be consumed on every possible platform. In 2010, you may remember that this was the era of M-dot websites. So if you were going to whateverdomain.com, you'd do that on your desktop, but if you tried to load that same link on your mobile, you would get m.whateverdomain.com and you'd get redirected there. And there were libraries and whole conferences literally around this idea of what we called sniffing or mobile detection, being able to detect that a request was made from a mobile browser. And our Mr. Marcotte here looked at this, shook his head sadly, and basically in a very polite, educated, scholarly way with this article told the entire industry that they were frickin' stupid. And everybody sat up and took notice because he presented an idea of, we have CSS. CSS has feature detection in it. Instead of trying to look for this user agent string and decide if that's a mobile browser or not, why don't we use the feature detection that is built into CSS and ask CSS to do the work for us? So the types of feature detection that he was talking about was being able to tell things like the maximum and minimum width of the screen that you're on and maximum and minimum height of the screen that you're on. That is something that is automatically exposed by the browser client as a property to the CSS engine. So that means if I load this site on this screen, on this big TV, on my phone, whichever browser I load it into, and even like whichever orientation of my phone I use, the device is actually going to tell the code what size it is. So if we can get access to that information, then what we should be doing is building our styles so that we only ever have to build the site, deploy the content once. And then that the design of how that content is presented responds to the environment it's in. And we've all seen this if we've ever gone and bought new bedding. Anybody ever gone and bought like one of those bed in a bag sets? Walmart, $100? Yeah, okay. Spencer's done it. Don't be ashamed. I buy bed in a bag. They're pretty. For a time, and then you go spend another $100. You know, it's like a haircut, except I don't have that problem. Yeah, you go buy a bed in a bag, and you get something, you know, it's about this big. You're like, cool, there's a blanket in there maybe? And you open it up, and it's actually like a duvet and a cover and sheets and pillowcases and a, you know, underskirt for your bed, and there's like a toaster in there, and there's like everything that you could possibly imagine crammed into this little bag, and that content has been made to respond to that container. It's been squished and compressed. If you see the storage things where you vacuum all the air out and you can put like your entire wardrobe in a Ziploc bag, and it's amazing that, you know, we do these things. There's no reason we shouldn't be able to do that with our content here on the web when we deploy it. This idea that a company has to employ a web team and a mobile team and all of that is ridiculous. You should just be able to have a content team, let that people who do development, people who do design, people who write content, like let those people do their jobs and then build the digital property so that it responds to the environment that it's in. So with that in mind, one of the first techniques I want to talk about is, let me get this big enough so you can see it. In fact, you see how the site's doing what it's doing? And like changing the content and rearranging it based on my zoom level? That's responsive design. So I'm getting this big enough so you can see it. And this is one of the first things I want to teach you because it is one of the easiest ways to help every piece of web content you will ever put out into the world. Add this one tag to every page you do. It is just 100% required, and I will send out this link. This tag right here, the second one, so meta name equals viewport, content equals width equals device width, initial scale equals 1. So, first off, philosophical question, what's a meta tag? Okay, so that answer is not bad. It's something that passes information to the application, but by that logic, so is a script tag. So you're headed in the right direction. I like where you're going with that. Somebody tell me a little bit more. Calgary, please feel free to jump in if you want to. Tell me a little bit more about a meta tag, and please don't quote the hipster. Oh my God, it's so meta. Social media too. Yeah, what Misha's talking about there is meta tags can be used to impact your SEO. So that tells me how they can be used. Doesn't tell me what a meta tag is. Alex has given us, it provides information about the HTML on the page. So does the this link tag. To Google, yeah. Okay, I'll throw you a bone here. When we talk about the concept of metadata, we're not talking about the data itself, we're talking about context. Meta tags set the context for how that content should be consumed. You know, it's like when you have a comedian that stands up and he's like, okay, I'm not racist, but That's meta setting the context of I'm about to say something really racist. And that I believe in it, but I don't want you to judge me for it. That's, you know, what that comment means. And it's called a meta comment. Like linguistically, that's what its actual name is, because it's setting the context for how we're going to consume that content. A meta tag on a page does the same thing. Meta tags get used for a lot of things, and it's something I actually complain gently to the curriculum team about, because we don't teach enough about them. You know, if you paste a link in Slack and it pops up with that little website card, that all comes from meta tags that have been put onto that page. That's not just Slack magically making a pretty little box. Like the title and the description and the picture that shows up, that's data that's all set in meta tags on that page. So Slack is going out, fetching that content, reading those meta tags, and then building the box based on that content. Twitter cards, Facebook cards, that's how that works when you paste a URL into one of those services. Meta tags also, you've ever gone to the page and especially in Chrome, you know, you go to a page that's in another language and Chrome pops up that helpful little yellow bar that says, like, you know, this is in Urdu, would you like to translate it, or whatever it may be. It knows that because there's a meta tag on the page that actually defines what language that the page is written in, because the developers have added that meta tag in order to give the context for how to consume that content. So that's the purpose of a meta tag on an HTML page, and it literally gets its name from how we meta comment in real life. So this one here, the name of this, so meta tags, we can have many meta tags, and they'll have a name and a name and content. And what that does is it allows us to affect the settings of a lot of things. For example, if it's in a different language, that may prompt the computer, the browser, to load up a different character set, you know, just so that it has the right context. But in this case, we're talking about the name is the viewport. And viewport is literally what we see in the box. Viewport is, I want to say it's a synonym for window, but it's not, because whenever we talk about the browser and window, that's actually an object. That's our global object, so I can't talk about window. But that over here, you can't see out the window, Calgary, but there's a window right there. That is a viewport. There's a whole wall of them. You know, in your house, you probably have a viewport into, you know, a courtyard or a parking lot or whatever it may happen to be. Each viewport gives you a particular view into some content. And this time, the content is setting some properties on how the content of the body of the page is going to be perceived. So it's starting off by setting the width of the viewport to be the full width of the device. So we're saying that however wide the device can handle, we want the viewport to be that wide. So we have the most possible real estate. And then what we're saying is that the initial scale, and this is like zoom level basically, is 1. So that we want to be not zoomed out, not zoomed in. We just want to start off at a base level of trying to render that content as it was intended. One of the tricks that some people used for the longest time, think Wikipedia. You know, Wikipedia is just this big wall of text, black text on a white background. And so one of the tricks that would get used is developers would set the initial scale to be like 2 or 3 times the normal size. So that way you'd load it in your mobile browser and it would be readable on that screen. Of course, you're having to scroll, you know, 100 miles to the left and the right and up and down to read everything. But yeah, that would be one of the tricks that they would use. Hey, Ely. Hey, Stephen. Hey, person whose name I forgot. Thank you. Hi, Scott. Bye, Scott. She's an alumni and the other 2 aren't. So yeah, they would set the initial scale. This is saying we want the initial scale to be 1. There's a huge, huge win of setting the initial scale to be 1, because that means any other CSS you write that targets this device width, you're guaranteed that things like font sizes and if you set absolute widths for things are going to be what you set them to. And you don't have to worry about stuff being skewed or out of proportion, or you know, what happens when you position absolute something and then somebody zooms in and it just gets squashed, which is why we don't use position absolute unless we have to. So initial scale 1 means that everything is going to be evaluated at its initial level, which is great because that means that the code we wrote actually matters. Otherwise it doesn't. So this is one of your first tricks that is going to help you. The second one that's going to help you, hey, come on, is how you specify the sizes of things. So as developers, when we first start off and we're working with CSS, we love pixels. Pixels are great because 100 pixels is 100 pixels is 100 pixels. That's never going to change. But what you have to realize is that 100 pixels proportionally on a phone in portrait mode is a lot different than 100 pixels on a 40-inch TV in landscape mode. Very different size. And there are times that we want to have design elements and especially layout elements that are more proportional. And there are 2 ways that we can get this. One of these is using a different, well, both of them are using a different unit for our sizes than just straight pixels. The first one that I'll talk about, because it's the more confusing of the 2 and I want to get it out of the way, is this concept of rems and ems. Rem in this case does not mean the sleep that you are not normally getting, unless you're Michelle, who got 11 hours last night, and I'm jealous. So the idea of an em, to start with, an em, is that it is a unit of measurement relevant to the typeface that is supposed to be roughly the width of the letter M, lowercase letter m, sorry, uppercase letter M, in that typeface. Because that and W are basically the widest letters that we have in any typeface. And if we are in a monospace, like a console kind of font, all the letters are the same width anyway, and it doesn't matter. But a lot of fonts, and especially when you start getting into things like Arial, Garamond, Georgia, Trebuchet, like some of those other fonts that people love to use because they're gorgeous. Comic Sans and Papyrus can die in a fire. But the EM is designed to be a width roughly equivalent to the uppercase letter M in that language. Now, here we start off with this block quote here, which says an EM is relative to the font size of its direct or nearest parent. So what that means is if I have a div and I set the font size on that div to be, say, 1.2 EMs, which would be 20% larger than the regular font size. All of the other tags inside that div are going to have that 1.2 EM inside of it. That's the cascading part of cascading style sheets. But there's another way that we can specify it, which is rem. And that means it is relative to the root, whatever is set, for example, on the body. The body is the root for that document, and we can set a font size on there, and that will be what it's relevant to now, or relative to. Here's where this gets interesting, because Imagine if instead of inside that div, we were just setting font sizes. Imagine if we were making a menu. We're going to have some drop downs inside that div. And so we had a bunch of list items that we were turning into menu elements. So I could set the width of those LIs using ems or rems instead of setting that width by pixels. So that means if somebody zooms in and I've got it set to 5 rems as my width, then however much they zoom in, it's going to be proportional at that point. Whereas if I set it to be 100 pixels, I've kind of locked that in to what it's going to be. And so starting to work with setting layout like block element sizes using ems and rems means you're now making the size of elements relative to the zoom level of the typeface. So now it's more proportional based on how scaled your site is. So if I load it on a 13-inch laptop, if I load it on a 40-inch TV, if I load it on a 6-inch screen, it responds much better. And so the challenge is, though, it's hard to think in that unit of measurement. We don't think about how many letters wide we want something to be. So it does take some practice. But in doing this, this is one of the 2 ways that you can now guarantee that the layout sizes of your site is going to respond to whatever device you're on. And then you just have to decide whether you're going to use ems or rems, depending on what you want that size to be relative to. Yep. Yeah. So yeah, what Eric's calling out here is that he mentions in this block that there have been issues that have caused him to switch back from rem to em. And for someone who has never used any of these, is it better to start off with em? Generally I work with almost exclusively ems. Rem works if you're not doing a lot of font size changes throughout your site. But I'll give you a perfect case of where em is a much better solution. We've seen it on a bunch of sites where you have something like a big like H1, H2 sized header. And on the right-hand side of that will be like either a link icon or an edit icon or a star icon, something like that. Typically that's done with an icon font. And if you're doing it with ems inside of an H1 or an H2, that icon font gets really big. Whereas doing it with rems means it's relative to the overall size of the document and it stays nice and small. So that's a time when you might want to make a decision of one over the other. Yeah, I mean, it's if you do everything with ems, you're not going to be wrong. And then once you get comfortable with what that difference is in terms of being relative to the root element, you can start to add rems as you need them. But yeah, I would definitely start with ems. Okay, so the other way to deal with this, and I'm just going to keep using CSS tricks because the site's awesome. So, this is the CSS Tricks definitive article on setting the width. And the very first example they have here is a width 80%. And the percent is the other key unit that you want to use instead of straight pixels. In fact, I would encourage you as a first step towards building things responsively to start using percentages. One of the reasons is they're very easy to think in because we've been trained to think in percentages since like grade 3. The second reason is you're guaranteed when you're using percentages that changing the font size is not going to affect the size of your element. You're guaranteed that 80% is 80% is 80%, and it doesn't matter what screen size you are on. It's easy to think in. It's an easy way to divide things up. Like when Carl was doing, when he built a grid with you guys on whatever that was, Monday, like that was one of the things, was like, hey, we can do these as percentages and then they will automatically flex in size, shrink and grow, so that the grid layout always looks the way we want it to look. Percentages are awesome for doing layouts because you're guaranteed that it's going to work. And when you take the next step and you go into things like actual Flexbox or CSS Grid, it's figuring out percentages for you. But percentages are a great way for you to take that step forward into, instead of setting every width as pixels, setting it as a percentage. Even if a lot of them are 100%, you're still in control of how much space in that container a particular element is taking. And here's the really cool thing, and why I like this article, because it's the second example they give. Width is not the only property we want to be setting. And here's where you go from being at the mercy of your CSS to now being in control of your CSS. So we want to set widths, especially when we're doing layouts, for like how wide the main section or the sidebar or the nav bar, something like that is going to be. But we can also set a max width and a minimum width. Because if we have, let's say we've got like your standard kind of 75-25 layout where 75 is the main and 25 is the sidebar, right? Well, if you start zooming in or zooming out or something like that, that sidebar may go down to like nothing. And here's where your pixels actually can help you. So you can set that sidebar to say be a width of 20% or 25%, but with a minimum width of say 200 pixels. So that means it will take up 25% of the screen. That's its default setting, but it will never go narrower than 200 pixels. So you'll always have room to be able to show stuff there. And similarly, with the 75%, you can set the width to be 75%, and the maximum width it will ever be, you might want to say like 1,000 pixels or something dumb like that. Because then it will never go, you're never going to have like some great big, if it goes up on a Jumbotron or something, you're never going to have it be totally ridiculously out of proportion. So min width and max width are great ways for you to put bounds on things. Here's the other time where these properties really come in handy. Think about setting the avatar for a profile. So one of the things you can be guaranteed is that no matter what you tell someone about the size of the image that they should upload as their avatar, you will get bigger ones and smaller ones, and it will never be the size that you wanted it to be. So you can do things like displaying somebody's avatar image with a width. But you can also give it a min width, so that no matter how big it is, min width and max width, so that no matter how big or small it is, it never grows or shrinks below or above those sizes that you want it to be. So you're now guaranteed a certain image size all the time that you get to work with in your layout. If you have a section for a title on a blog post or a project or something like that on your page, and somebody, you would have, every time you thought about typing it in, you typed about 40 or 50 characters. That worked out great. And then you get the person that shows up and they type like Q and enter. And suddenly your layout breaks because it's now one letter when you were always expecting it to be 40 or 50. So being able to set min widths means that that never collapses so far that it breaks your layout. These are powerful things that you get to add and allow you to have what we would call a robust layout, meaning it's not prone to errors or not prone to breaking based on bad content. So these become super powerful. So now we're in a situation where we can set the viewport. and force the device to always be at its, assuming its full width and never zooming out or in unless we tell it to. We have units like rems, ems, and percentages that we can use to dictate the size of our layout elements and make it relative to the device width size instead of being fixed pixel sizes, which now means that we can come to a site like this, and I can come down here and grab the bottom corner of my browser, and I can whip it back and forth as much as I want and give Calgary a seizure, and the site's going to respond perfectly fine. And we've already seen the difference in how it behaves just from me zooming in. Things like, now here I am fully zoomed out, and we can see that on the left-hand side, all of the icons have labels on them, like text labels. But as soon as I zoom in, only the one, oh, it does actually still show them. There's a point, I know, where I think it stops doing that. Oh, they fixed that. Yeah, cool. They fixed it. There was a point where they would just show the picture icons because now the text didn't work as well, but apparently they fixed it. This site is the Bible of how CSS is done. It's amazing. In fact, you're going to see a lot of embedded code pens on here because the guy that runs this site, Chris Coyer, is the one that invented CodePen. So he knows a little bit about what he's doing. Really cool guy too. So that puts us in a good place. And yeah, I'm definitely going to encourage you to read this link when I send it to you. So then we get to the last big piece of the puzzle. And I will just grab it from here. Here we go. The last big piece of the puzzle is I told you that devices report their sizes to CSS. How do we get access to that? Well, we get access to it using something called a media query. And so media queries are just a way for us to conditionally use a certain set of CSS. It's literally like writing a big if statement in our code. If the device is this size, do this. That's literally all a media query is. Now that you understand what the function of it is, then we can talk about syntax. But literally all a media query does is test to see if the device that it's being shown on is a certain size. That's all the magic right there. So the way it looks, let's look at iPhones. They're in the news. These are complicated, but these are default ones that you can literally just copy and paste these into your code and they work. So the way a media query works is we have to decide what media we want to query. We could have screen, we could have print. There's actually a couple different medias that we could potentially be displaying this content on. So in this case, we only want to test the screen, and we are looking for a couple things. The minimum device width is 320 pixels, and the maximum device width is 480 pixels. So that's an iPhone 4 or 4S, tiny little screens. The WebKit min device pixel ratio, that's a very technical specification, which if you really want to read up on it and find out what it means, great, go for it. But it's basically the way Apple compresses, or the way Safari compresses pixels to show things. And for the record, it's dumb. So that's portrait and landscape. Here's just the portrait mode, 320 and 480. And we can actually query the orientation of a device as to whether it's portrait or landscape. By default, all desktops report as landscape. Here's iPhone 5, 5S, 5C, 5SE. You can see that we have a maximum width that's a little bit bigger, 568 pixels. iPhone 6, 6S, 7, and 8. Now we're up to a minimum width of 375 and a maximum width of 667. And you don't have to always test all these values. You could just test one of them. You know, if the maximum width is 667 pixels, you know you're on a small screen. That's the max that it can possibly be, is 667. There ends up being certain numbers that you just end up memorizing because you run into them all the time. Like 1920. 1920 is a great number to know off of the top of your head because that's the number of pixels wide that a standard MacBook screen is. It's also 1920 by 1080, so when we talk about 1080 HD, that's where we're getting that from. Because it's 1920 across and 1080 high. So, which is like a 3:2 orientation, roughly. So yeah, there are certain numbers you just run into. I will tell you from experience that for the longest time, you built your pages to fit in a 1024 wide screen that was 768 pixels high. 1024 by 768, you know, you might have seen that on like your monitor resolution screen before, and that number was critical. That was the magic number that your site had to fit within that. You would never ever build anything that was more than 1024 pixels wide because that was design suicide. And people wouldn't use it because nobody likes to scroll horizontally. So now what we have is we have a way to put this in our CSS, and you notice that it's got the curly braces here because inside that is where we write CSS. So if it meets this criteria, then apply all of the CSS that's inside this block. And we would use our standard selectors and our standard, you know, classes and IDs, and we would write a set of CSS inside this media block that would only be applied if these settings matched. Your normal CSS. Huh? Potentially, if that's what it took. If that's how much needed to change for it to show properly on the screen. So the question was, what would you be putting in there? Would it be a whole page worth of code? Potentially. It might be just 3 or 4 selectors. So the question is, would you be making different pages for each size of phone? No, absolutely not. The whole point of this is to not have to do that. That you would build one page and then decide what style rules are going to change so that it shows properly on that size of screen. And you know, a lot of times what happens is, you know, when we show something on a mobile screen, you know, we'll, instead of having a wide layout, we'll collapse everything down into one big column. So that means we change like our grid layout sizes. Everything would just become with 100%. Oh no, for the style sheets, no, typically you've just got it as one big style sheet. The biggest reason for doing that is you always want to limit the number of HTTP requests that your page has to make for performance reasons, because it is always going to be less time to request one big file than many small files. Yeah. So yeah, I now have a way that I can conditionally write CSS that I just decide what properties of the screen I want to look for, and then I can put all the CSS in there that customizes the appearance of my content to that particular screen. So that's super powerful now. And while I'm on the subject of media queries, I will also tell you that one of the more professional habits that you want to adopt is having a print style sheet. Or basically having a section of your style sheet that is at media print. Because when you go and you print a web page, you don't want all the headers and the navigation menus and the ads to pop up, and you don't, you know, want to print off that it was blinking an ad for shoes or something like that. You don't need all the notifications across the top. You just want the content laid out nicely as a document. And when you go to a site and you print it and it looks great and doesn't have any of that stuff, it is because specifically there is a set of styles defined for displaying that content in a print media. So we can define, as web devs, how our content gets printed. So if you are ever building a site that has resource documents or, you know, interesting blog posts or FAQs or maps or anything like that, I encourage you to take the extra time and the steps to do a print style sheet. And there's an easy way to test it without having to kill trees. Print to PDF. Every browser does it now. And so you save to PDF when you go to print, and then you can see how that document looks, because it's going to look exactly as a PDF as it's going to look on the printer. And you can test and make sure that things look the way you want them to. And that's that extra level of finesse that separates a well-done website from something that just got hacked together. But it's media queries that allow that to work. Oh, cool. Okay, thoughts on mobile first, or is responsive just outright better? Okay, so Alex has got a really awesome question here. So he's asking about something called mobile first, and mobile first is a design mentality. And so I'm going to speak to this not quite in a hand-wavy way, but I do want to speak to it, but I'm not going to go in depth with it because this isn't a design course. But the idea behind mobile first is that when you are designing your content for how it's going to show up, you're going to design how it's going to show up on this screen first. Because if you can make it work well on a small screen, making it work on a big screen is easy. You know, if you make it work on a screen that's only 800 pixels wide and I suddenly give you 1920 pixels, you've got, you know, it's like moving from a one-bedroom to a mansion. Like, you've suddenly got all the room in the world. So doing mobile first means that you're really focusing on the user's consumption of the content, what the interface is going to be like, how you're going to notate like state changes and things like that, what your notifications, all of your interactions have to work on mobile first. And there's a huge amount of value in doing mobile first because, like I said, if you can get it to work on that small screen, getting it to work on a bigger screen is easy. The downside to mobile first is you're starting off having made a lot of compromises, and now my phone's buzzing. You're starting off having made a lot of compromises in what your layout is going to do. And you are now in the position where you most definitely have to design your site twice. Once for mobile and once for desktop, because if nothing else, you're almost always considering a portrait versus a landscape orientation. So it is extra design work to do mobile first, and that is a con, but from a content consumption, UX interaction from that perspective, it's a huge win. The other question is, you know, is responsive just outright better? I'm going to argue that responsive is outright better. And the reason I'm going to argue that, even though I do like a lot of the pros of mobile first, responsive design is better because we write HTML to give context to content. HTML does not determine appearance in any way, shape, or form. And if you're still using the font tag, please stop now. We have content, we want it to be consumed. I'm going to design that content agnostic of what platform it's going to be viewed on. If I'm going to write a blog post, if I'm going to put out a tutorial, if I'm going to record a video, I don't care what device you're viewing that on. So I want to design the delivery of that content in a way that doesn't compromise based on what device it's being viewed on. So if I design responsively first, then I'm just saying, okay, if the screen's smaller, we'll make this adjustment, and I'm not having to design twice. So that's my complete hashtag in my personal opinion. You may find other designers and developers who will passionately, religiously argue any one of the other directions, and that's awesome. It is only an opinion. You're going to go with what makes you feel the most productive. So awesome question. Thank you for asking, Alex. That's a really good question. Any questions about the concepts I've covered so far? Now you'll notice that I'm not doing, sorry, Sylvia, one sec. You'll notice I'm not doing live code with these because the biggest reason is because I can only show you an implementation for a particular layout. It's not going to help you do it when you have to do it on your screen for something different that you're working on. And if I show you how to do it on something like Tweeter, well, then I'm doing the work for you, and I'm not going to send that code out. And you're all going to be copying furiously instead of paying attention to what I'm saying. So that's why I'm not live coding this stuff, because these are kind of broad toolkit techniques that you use, and you learn about them by doing them in the particular use case that you have. What was your question? Mm-hmm. 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 Totally fine. No. No. So the reason I'm hesitating in how I answer this question is because when we start talking about SAS after the break, changes all the rules. Like 100% changes all the rules. Yeah, okay, so thank you. So Calgary, what her question was I had mentioned, in response to Eric's earlier question about having all the media style sheets being, in a single file, but yet Tweeter had 3, so should they all be in one? What's the best practice for that? Okay, so I will always say, because it's 100% true, that less loading of style sheets is better. So if you can load everything in one style sheet, all the wins. Having 3 on Tweeter, not the worst. Where you put your media queries doesn't matter, because there's only going to be specificity challenges in here. Actually, yeah, if you put the media queries first and then wrote the regular styles under, the regular ones would win. So I guess media queries should always kind of be at the end of your CSS. So whichever the last file you're loading is, put your media queries in there if you were going to do it that way. If you have 10 or 12 style sheets being loaded, that's an issue. 3, not the worst. 1 is always better than anything over 1. So we're talking about best practices versus the allowable limits here. But like I said, when we get to SAS in about 20 minutes, all the rules change. So please don't take things I'm saying as if they're chiseled in stone. Because while I'm giving best practices, those are protocols, and there's always exceptions. Having 3 CSS files for Tweeter is not a bad thing. Generally, you want to have all your media queries together just so they're easy to find, and I would generally put them in at the end of whatever the last CSS file is that's being loaded, just for specificity reasons. But again, I'll talk about SAS later, and that changes everything. So, cool. Any other questions about either percentages, IMs, RIMs, media queries, meta viewport? Building an entire style in percentages is a noble undertaking, and if you do it and nail it, you'll feel awesome about yourself. It is. It is worth it. You just have to... This is where... So the thing is, building it with percentage widths is great. Where you're going to be able to save yourself so that you do nail it is with the min width and the max width. And that's where you might go to pixels for things. Yeah. IMs versus percentages for paddings and margins. That is an awesome question. So I personally typically use IMs for paddings and percentages for margins, because I want the padding to be relative to the size of the content inside the box, whereas the margin is affecting the overall layout of the page, so I want that to be in percentages. Yeah, that's my personal practice. I know there are some devs who do everything in IMs and some devs who do everything in percentages. whichever one works for you. I do it with M's inside and percentages outside. My brain manages to make that work somehow.
But don't use pixels for
Again, I'm not chiseling anything in stone. In my opinion, if you can avoid using pixels, then do. Yeah. Yeah, I tend to be opinionated, but that doesn't mean dogmatic. But, Benji.
What about like using
Ah, okay. Awesome question. So let me introduce you to this property. Um, I will reiterate in just. So, yeah, VH and VW, not the car. Um, Basically, there's another unit that's available, and it's a newer unit, so it's not as commonly used, but they're called viewport units, um, which is VH is vertical height or viewport height, and VW is viewport width. And VH unit is equal to 1% of the height of the initial containing block. So if you have something that is 3 VH, that represents 3% of the total height of the initial containing block. So that's the HTML tag on a page. So, and then there's, let's see if he gets into VWs. I will definitely send this link out as well. Okay. He doesn't talk about VWs in this particular article. This one's just about the VHs. But the problem with using VHs for width layouts, because I know a lot of people will try and do that, is that if the ratio changes, you end up with some funky measurements. And it's because, the reason I say that is because a lot of people, for example, will have their browser at this size. And then there are other people who will put it up here like this. And that starts changing the ratios quite a bit. And so if you're using VH units for anything measuring width, you're running the risk of breaking your ratios. And so things will get skewed and stuff will move in places that you didn't expect it to move to. So I would avoid using VHs for width sizes. VWs at that point are better. Things I never thought I'd say in boot camp. Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience working with VHs and VWs in layouts, though the idea that I have this unit that is, always 1% of either my height or my width is awesome. Where it breaks down is doing internal smaller divisions. So if I'm looking at the standard kind of bootstrap layout where I've got a row of 12 cells, and inside one of those cells I've also set up another row of 12 cells, so it has its division of 8.16% or whatever it is for each one of those boxes. I couldn't use VHs or VWs for that because I want it to be proportional to the size of that box, not just proportional to the size of the overall screen. For overall page layout, VHs and VWs are great, but not for the inner subdivisions as much, because then I start having to do fractional VHs and VWs. So, yeah, I'll definitely send this one out as well, and there's some links at the bottom here about fun with viewport units, so you'll be able to check that one out. But let's go ahead and take a break, 10 minutes, and when we come back, we'll do SAS. Okay. So, SAS. So what I'm going to demonstrate when talking about SAS is one of the many options that are available. SAS is a technology, it's a library that is one of a whole category of libraries for CSS called preprocessors. There's the two most famous ones. One's called SAS, the other's called less, with their joke being less is more. There's also one called Stylus. There's one called Compass, which gets confusing when we're talking about it here at Lighthouse. And they're all good. I can't say really anything against any of them. SAS just happens to be the one that is considered the most industry standard. So I'm going to show you this one. This by no means says that this is the only one that you can ever use or that you shouldn't use any of the other ones or try it out. They're awesome. They do great stuff. The whole goal behind these being developed is by front-end developers who end up writing a lot of CSS and get tired of having to do the same actions over and over and over again. As a general rule in programming, anytime you've done some really painful analog action twice, automate it. And that's what a preprocessor is designed to do. So, a few things off the top. What is preprocessing? So preprocessing is actually running your style sheets through this library, through this engine, to get a final style sheet, one single big style sheet. See, I told you all the rules change. You can have a whole bunch of different modules for your style sheets. You can have directories and directories and directories of style sheets and have them all compiled into one beautiful style sheet that's in the right order, specificity is correct, all the CSS is correct, and that's the one that gets distributed with your application. That's the idea behind a preprocessor. And if we're going to be going through and running the styles that we write through this engine, we can take advantage of the fact that we can optimize some of the things we do in those style sheets before they get compiled to CSS. And that's where SAS really, really shines. So preprocessing is something that you would do before you would deploy your site, before you would run npm start, before you would ever put it up to a server like Heroku or something like that. It's pre-processing, literally, something that's done before your CSS is processed. So I want to show you some of the cool things that SAS has. First off, variables. When you have a big app, you're going to have a set of colors that define the branding of that particular app. Think about your bank's website, for example. If you're CIBC, you've got two different shades of maroon, you've got gold, you've got white. If you're TD, you've got about 3 different shades of green and white and black. Each bank has their colors, right? Imagine if that wasn't just like green or 00FF00, and you had to remember some like 9B108CF or something like that every single time you wanted to use that particular color. That would be painful. As a dev, you'd just get to the point that you have it memorized, it would be muscle memory, or you can just set a variable for it called like main green. And then anywhere in your code that you needed that color, instead of having to remember RGB values or some weird hex value, you just use $ main green. Ta-da! It's the same reason we use variables in our code, so that we don't have to keep retyping data and we don't have to keep rebuilding data structures every single time we need them. We just put it in a variable, give it an easy to remember name that reflects what it is, so that we can reuse that data later. So having variables in CSS is actually great. Because now what the standard practice is with a lot of SAS is you have one SAS file that just defines all the main colors, like color variables, for your app. And then all of your other files will reference those colors, and when it all gets compiled together, SAS puts those hex values or those RGB values where they're supposed to be, and your colors are all there. And all you have to remember is like main green, secondary green, accent color, stuff like that. Be so much easier to work with. Nesting. So this, when you first see it, you're like, yeah, okay, fine. But I want to tell you that when you start doing this, this will change the way you write CSS forever and ever and ever. You just have to get into the habit of doing it. So I'll actually start off, and let's make this look like CSS. So let's say we have a nav bar. So we're going to do something like nav, and we'll do background color black, and width 100%, and position fixed, and top 0, and left 0. We'll put a little bit of padding in there, say 10 pixels. You know, we could also do 2 EM, which would probably be better. So we would define these things, but then we're going to have elements that are children to that nav bar. So we're probably going to have like an image in there that's the logo. So nav image, that would be the selector we would use. You know, we're going to say something like it's going to have a, you know, a max width of, you know, we'll give it 250 pixels, and we'll set the width to be 10% out of the box. And maybe we'll give it a border of 1 pixel solid black. And then we're probably going to have like a UL, and it's going to have its rules. And then there's going to be the nav UL LI, and that's of course going to be display inline block, because that's how we get a menu in a nav bar. And you know, we're going to have all these things, and it's nav something, nav something, nav something, nav something, right? So let's compare that. And I'm going to write the same code. I'm going to just borrow this code here, because we would start off with this. Except instead of having to now write other selectors, in here, I get this code. And here, I'm going to have my UL. And inside here, I'm going to have the LI. And this gets translated out to the code on the left. And because I am nesting it all inside of the declaration for nav, I'm able to communicate to SAS that the inner declarations only apply for those elements, those selectors that are inside of nav. And SAS writes it out for me the right way. So I don't have to type the extra overly specific selectors to indicate what I want. Now, here's an interesting case, which is we're inside of our LI here, and one of the things that a lot of sites like to do, let's say, for example, that we want, when we hover over the LI, that it goes from black background and white text to white background and black text. We want that inversion of color when you hover over it. So the natural instinct would be like, oh, well, I'm inside my UL, so now I can define another rule for LI hover and have background color white, color black, you know, and just swap out that way. But I don't have to do that. I can actually nest it inside of my LI and use the ampersand. And that refers to the element that I'm inside of. So that way I can define meta classes or pseudo classes inside of a particular definition or declaration and not have to worry about having extra declarations showing up underneath. So inside of something like my LI, I can define all the pseudo classes that would apply. If I need to have a like a before or after pseudo element, can do that. Things like active or focused, if I want to set the state for an input element, I can just do it inside of the input declaration using nesting and using the ampersand as a reference to the element that I'm inside of at that moment. Yeah, Spencer.
If you had more than one type of element tag inside of your UL, would this ampersand still be referencing the LI?
Yeah, because that's it. So the question is, if I had more than one element inside of my UL, would this still be referencing the LI? And yes, it would, because I would be doing this. That's proper indentation.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It helps if I write the code correctly so that you can see what I'm talking about. Yeah. That's almost like a word of advice. Indenting correctly so that people helping you can see what you're... We'll work on it. So this is nesting in Sass, and it is immensely powerful. It feels weird the first half dozen times you do it, because you're like, oh, this isn't how I type CSS, this is just wrong. Why would anybody want to do this? And then the first time you see it just like magically save you a whole bunch of time and keep you from making specificity errors, you thank Sass while on your knees, you know, shaking your hand skyward. This is honestly awesome. Yeah, Mandy. So the question is this something that you can just do now, or do you have to use Sass to do it? You have to use Sass to do it. CSS does not do this out of the box. If it did, there would be a worldwide, just, you know, people would be screaming in happiness. You know, dogs and cats cuddling together on corners, lawyers telling the truth, babies quiet. Like, it would be a miracle day if we could do this in CSS. We're not there yet. That being said, this has been proposed just about every year for the past 5 years to the W3, like the standards board, World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, to be ratified as part of the CSS spec. The earliest we might get it is CSS 4, maybe. And this is one of those cases like what happened with jQuery. So jQuery's use of the $sign and its selector engine, Sizzle, was so popular and so revolutionary for dealing with JavaScript that that's why we got document.querySelector. So they added document.querySelector to the JavaScript spec because this library that became so widespread and used demonstrated a use case for having that functionality that truthfully upgraded the language. This upgrades CSS huge. You know, everything that we've ever talked about, you know, not using a mouse or saving time by learning keyboard shortcuts, this is one of those efficiency builders that once you start learning to do this, it is just huge. I can't speak out enough in advocation of this. So, partials. So this is how we break Sass files down into smaller pieces. So we could write just one great big CSS file. Totally fine. Sass will do exactly what you want it to do. Or we can break things down into modules. You know, break things down into small, hyper-targeted files. And then we're going to use import, which is the next piece here, to import all of our files in the order in which we want them. So for example, here's one of those reset files like what Carl was showing you earlier in the week. And then what we would do is at import reset at the top of another file, like our base.sass file, and then all of this code gets imported here at the top. And so the pattern that you will see a lot is you will see that people will break things down and you'll have like at import colors, at import base, at import nav, @import main, @import sidebar. And so what you'll end up doing is you'll end up writing a small little module with just the styles in it for some part, some structural piece of your page, and then you will just have one main Sass file that imports all of these modules together in the order that you want, and that's what gets compiled together into your final CSS file, which is what you link into your site. So this is why I was hesitating so much when I was answering Sylvia's question earlier about having 3 CSS files in Tweeter versus just having one big one, because like down here I'd probably also have like media queries, and all my media queries would be in one module, and I just import that at the end. But this would all get compiled from this. Each one of those files gets read in, the nesting gets translated, the variables get translated, and it turns into one big final correct CSS file that I can link into my project. So this is what the standard practice is with Sass, is to just have one file that imports everything in the order that you want it to go. So partials and importing become huge and become really valuable as a way for you to now be able to better maintain your CSS. As we've seen from doing now a couple different projects, now that if you have a small file targeted with just one specific task in it, like the character counter for Tweeter, for example, it's a lot easier to just go and work on that file and work on that code than having to have some big, huge monolithic file that you're, command F-ing in to find the piece you need and scrolling up and down and all the time. Whereas if you just have small modules, much easier to maintain.
Is that different because you're not making more requests, or because the initial HTML page is linked from there, making the request that this is what happens?
Great question. So Eric's question is this different because we're not making a lot of requests, or is this different because this isn't what's actually linked into the HTML? So the processing of this file happens before you ever push your site somewhere to be loaded. You're going to do this as a development task, like compile this file as a development task. It will produce the CSS file that you link into your HTML, and then that's the file that gets loaded. Sass never gets processed on a live page. Doesn't happen. Sass is always processed as a separate task. I mean, there's a plugin we can use for Express that is a middleware for Sass, but even then what it does is when you make a request to your Express server, it looks to see if the Sass has changed. If it has, it quickly goes in the background, compiles it, and then puts the CSS file in place so that when the response gets returned, you get the right file. But that's, even then, that's not like live looking at Sass. The browser doesn't process Sass at all. It's a command line server-side tool, like development tool, that builds the file for us, and then we can link that file into our project. Make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that way we basically only end up making one request.
You only make the request if the index page or the main HTML page actually has request links. That's when you do something that has to pull back, because you all have to pull back.
Right.
You have the one page on your HTML that links to the global
Yeah.
style, which is already done.
It's the compiled version of all of this. Yeah. So, and then there's something called mixins. This is not what you do at the bar when you order a Long Island iced tea. This is a way to do something really neat that allows you to, it's almost like an inheritance in a way, like a class weird thing to allow you to define a set of properties that instead of having to rewrite them every time you want them, you can take this definition that you've written. It's almost like having a whole, instead of the variables that just hold a color, this is a variable that holds a whole set of CSS properties, and then you can put that variable that holds them into anything you want. And they used to have, Yeah, this one's not the worst. Here, I'll do an example of mixins that that you'll probably be able to understand a bit better. So what I'm going to do with mixins is I want to define a mixin for, I'm going to call it default button, just to give it a name. And in my default button, because I hate the styling of normal HTML buttons, I'm going to say that the min width is now, let's make it 10 letters wide. And there's going to be padding, and I want to kind of stretch out the button a bit. So I'm going to do 1 EM of padding on the top and bottom, and 2 EMs of padding on the left and the right. So that gives me a little bit wider rather than tall button. And by default, I'm going to set the font weight to bold, and let's set the background color to light gray. Yeah, that should be good. So that'll be our default button. Just a gray button, nice, a little bit wide. And that's great. And so what they show here is that we can use the directive @include. Now in this case, the mixin works like a function where you can pass a parameter to it, but you don't have to. What I'm going to do is I'm going to define a success button, like one of those nice green OK, this worked buttons. And I'm going to @include default button. And then I'm going to override the background color to be green. So now I've just gotten the min width, the padding, the font weight, all those definitions I've gotten. I've just included them in here. I don't have to retype them over and over. And if I want to have like a cancel button, @include default button, and background color is red. And now I don't have to retype those, to have all the buttons look the same. I don't have to retype that over and over and over again. I just get to bring in this min width, this padding, this font weight, and change the background color to whatever I want it to be, which is nice and easy. If you think about having, if you're using curved borders and you have to type out the border radiuses or drop shadows or that kind of thing, and you want to apply that same styling to lots of elements of your site, like, so that your article, like your main blog post, has a little bit of a drop shadow and rounded borders, but so does your sidebar, but so does your nav, but so do your buttons. You can just now mix in those definitions, literally like you would mix in ingredients in a cake, and you get the same thing everywhere. And it keeps you from having to retype it. So mixins are like a variable that holds multiple definitions, whereas the Sass variables just hold a single thing. That a clear difference? Cool. Extending an inheritance is kind of the same thing, where it's a different way to do the same thing, and depending on what you're trying to do, mixins tend to get used as functions a bit more to pass parameters. Extend tends to be just default. You can use both the same way. Whichever one you use, it works. And here's the last really cool thing I want to talk about when it comes to Sass. In CSS, there is a calc function that allows us to do some math, which is great, but it's always calculated on the fly. So there's a little bit of a performance hit there. Especially if you get into really fancy math with like transforms and rotations and animations and things like that, it can, especially on a phone, slow down a little bit. Not always, but depends on what kind of math you're doing. But with Sass, because this is all going to get run before the file gets, before the file is compiled, we don't have that same problem. We can take full advantage of running this through the CPU and do all this math, and then just get some final values that we can work with. So we have the ability to build in operators, math basically, into our CSS so that we can calculate values each time we need to build this file. And this is where things can get pretty cool, because when you write your media queries in SAS, if you have mixins that do calculations, then you can pass each screen width into the mixin, have it do the calculations based on that, and generate properties for each set of values. So you basically writing a mixin like a function that calculates widths and ratios and stuff like that for you. And when your file gets compiled, the mixin puts in the values for every single screen size that you need, and you only have to write those calculations once. There's no sitting there with a calculator next to your desk, or doing it on your phone while you're typing on your computer to try and figure it out. It just runs once and you're done. So being able to pre-calculate a lot of these values, huge performance improvement over using calc dynamically in CSS. And so this is really powerful. Now, let me talk about how you use SAS. SAS is a command line tool. SAS is actually originally written in Ruby, and it's something that you can just install. There is a Node SAS, which is the same thing but written in JavaScript. When you do install it, it does have to compile, because there's some of the things that it does require some of the system libraries. But it's actually, there's a whole section here on how to install it. For your project, there we go, npm install -g SAS. And the reason you want to do it -g is so that as a command line command, you can just type SAS and whatever you need to do. And the basic way it works is SAS, input file, output file. So if I had a file like this that was my main.sas file, then I would do SAS space main.sas to main.css. And so that's going to look in this, obviously if I need to look in different directories, I'm going to do that with my file paths, but I'm going to give it the input file and the output file. And then that main.css is what I would link in my HTML document. That's going to be the CSS for my page. And SAS, as a tool, has a really neat feature called watch. So you can run SAS -- watch and point it to a directory. And if any SAS files in that directory change, because, I don't know, you've typed different code and saved the file, so if anything changes, it automatically recompiles your SAS for you, so you don't have to go and rerun that command every time you make a change. It's a lot like using NodeMon and how it detects changes and auto restarts for you. It's that, but SAS. So it will detect when you make a change, and it will auto recompile for you, and I can pretty much guarantee that between the time you get from your editor to the browser and hit refresh, the code is compiled and ready to go. And if you can beat that, you've got to have either the fastest fingers ever or a really beefy system, in which case it's still going to compile faster than you can get there. SAS works really, really quickly. So using SAS Watch is, not Sasquatch, that's a big hairy guy, but SAS Watch is a really great thing for devs, because it means you don't have to interrupt your workflow to go recompile your file every time you make a change. You had a question? Okay, cool. All right, that brings us to 1040. So I've covered a lot of best practices and principles today. I know today was kind of philosophical. There wasn't a lot of live code really, but this is a lot of stuff that I'm showing you in the context of these are best practices. You learn by going and doing them now rather than by me demonstrating them for you, because I can only, with CSS, because it only applies to a certain set of HTML at any given point, CSS by itself is useless. I could stand up here and code all day, but until you do it on your code, you're not going to learn as much. So, Calgary, you guys have any questions? Vancouver, you guys have any questions? I'd ask Victoria, but they can't hear me. They're learning Ruby this week anyway. Alex is typing. Okay, so Alex's question is, can you collapse a margin by setting a margin above 100%, or should you use EM? Oh, this is a Coke and Pepsi question. So there's a school of thought that says that when you need margins to behave a certain way, you set really absurd values on them, like negative 999% to like collapse the margins one way, or really push another way. And the best practice says don't do that. If you find yourself having to use absurd values for margins to make your layout work, you need to rethink how you're doing your layout. The other best practice with this says that while this is a hack that works sometimes on some browsers, if browsers change their implementations and decide to truly adhere to all the web standards, in a perfect world all the browsers would do that, but they don't, then your hack stops working. So I do not advocate it as a best practice. It's a hack that works on certain browsers at certain times. And if you find yourself in the situation of having to use that, you need to go back and rethink how you're approaching your layout in order so that you don't have to hack your code to get it to work. You should just be able to write proper code directly the first time. So that's my answer to that question. Good question, though. Anything from here in Vancouver? Cool. I'm going to send out a whole big stack of links and references for you guys. Today's a great day. You know, I know a lot of you are still pushing on Twitter, but today's a great day to kind of just like read some stuff, let some things soak in, experiment a little bit, like build a WTF file for yourself to play with some things, and be willing to experiment with some of this new kind of design thinking mentality and these tools. Cool. Thanks, guys.